Welcome to Hope in the Future with Pastor Ben Foxworth. Check in with us here regularly to hear God's words of instruction and encouragement. And now, here's Pastor Ben.
Today I want to talk about the very first sermon that I ever preached in my life. And it was not at a church. As many of you have said many times, I knew that I was going to be a preacher before I even called on the name of the Lord for salvation. I just knew that this was what I was going to do. I mean, I fought it. I went through a stage, I want to be a zoologist. I want to be a professional wrestler. I want to be a weatherman. I want to do all these other things, but everything just kept coming back to preaching. Praise God. But I remember as a kid, and it was after a revival service, and I was home alone. I was probably 8 years old. So I don't think I was home alone, but I don't remember where anybody was at. But I remember preaching this passage to my dogs. That I took the arm of the couch, which was one of those 70s hippie couches, and you could put it up, and I put the Bible on it like it was a podium, and I preached to the 4 dogs that we had as a kid. I don't know if any of them got saved, but I know they heard the gospel. And ever since then, this passage has been the most studied passage of my entire life. I have read through this. I have studied it in so many different ways. And it is really one of my favorite things to preach about. The parable of the prodigal son. Before we get into the parable of the prodigal son, I think it's important that we talk about the ground rules of parables. Because I think sometimes it's easy to just think of parables as an analogy. And they're much, much different than an analogy. The definition of a parable was a simple story to illustrate a larger and at times a more complex truth. That Jesus would use these as a teaching tool, and it was usually for his disciples. The parables were not for unbelievers to get and understand. I'm not saying that they couldn't, but his parables were for his followers. Now, parables are not supposed to be dissected as much as sometimes they can be. Like I heard of a church a few years ago, the pastor preached for 8 weeks on the parable of the prodigal son. And I wondered, how can we try to stretch this out over 8 weeks when we just see what Jesus preaches here in one day? And that's because a lot of times what we try to do with parables is we want to find so much stuff that we sometimes try to glean stuff that's not even really in the parables. Parables are not supposed to be dissected so much. They're actually, as for believers at least, relatively easy to understand. They're not like the Da Vinci Code. If you remember the big craze of the Da Vinci Code that talked about how there's all these secret hidden clues throughout the Bible that's talking about, and throughout all of Da Vinci's artwork that points to a forbidden gospel and all that stuff. The parables are not supposed to be dissected so much. In other words, if there's a parable about the lost sheep, it would be a waste of time for us to spend time. What breed of sheep was it? Let's talk about the actual color scheme of the sheep and what that might have meant. Jesus didn't talk about that. Why do we need to talk about it? Sometimes the words are just the words. Jesus says what needs to be said. But we can take a lot out of what Jesus does say. I think sometimes we kind of want to look for some hidden truths in Scripture that maybe aren't there because we really don't want to pay attention to what is being said. Jesus was heavy with these parables. And the meaning of a parable will always start with who he's telling this parable to. In Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 10, the disciples came up and asked him, "Why are you speaking to them in parables?" He answered, "Because the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given for you to know, but it has not been given to them. For whoever has, more will be given to him, and he will have more than enough. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. That is why I speak to them in parables, because looking they do not see, and hearing they do not listen or understand. Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled in them. By the way, Isaiah 6, where Isaiah talks about the parables of the Messiah, which says, you will listen and listen, but never understand. You will look and look, but never perceive. Verse 15, for this people's heart has grown callous. Their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn back, and I would heal them. Blessed are your eyes because they do see, and your ears because they do hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see the things that you see, but didn't see them, to hear the things you hear, but didn't hear them. That's what Jesus meant when he talks about parables. What he wants people to understand when he says his parables. Now, the majority of the teaching we've all heard, how many here have heard messages or studies about the prodigal son before? So mostly everybody, and even the secular world, even the world around us know the understanding of the prodigal son story. The idea of a prodigal son is part of the vernacular. But the majority of this teaching, quite frankly, has been out of balance. Because when we read about the story of the prodigal son, we usually are putting so much emphasis on the younger son. The son that we call the prodigal son. And this wonderful story about he left home and had and participated in great sin and came back, and his father welcomed him back. And what a wonderful story that is. But that's only half of what happens in this parable. There is much more to it. So let's begin by talking about the definition of prodigal. Because you don't even really hear that word anymore unless somebody's talking about the prodigal son. The word prodigal really has two definitions. One is an extravagant. One is it's an extravagant. The prodigal means extravagant. In that aspect, we can look at this and say, the prodigal in the story was not the younger son, was not the older son, it was the father who was extremely extravagant with his son when he came home. I'm spoiling it if you haven't read it already. But there's another definition to prodigal, and that's wasteful. And so when we think of the story of the prodigal son, we think about this young, I was picturing him as a young guy, might not have been a young guy, but this guy goes out and he just goes and he wastes everything. Is that the prodigal son? Now this is an important parable. Because this is the parable that really lit the fuse for people to say, you know what? We gotta wipe this Jesus off the earth. This is the parable that set in action the notion that we gotta kill this guy. Because what Jesus talks about here, we've lost in the constant, half-hearted retelling of it. We've lost what the power and the purpose of what Jesus is saying here. And what Jesus is saying here in this parable was extremely divisive to people that didn't want to hear this parable. They didn't want to hear what Jesus was saying here. And it caused them to want to kill Jesus. Now, why kill Jesus? Why kill Jesus? Because didn't Jesus do good? I mean, you hear people who don't even profess to be Christian who talk about how, well, Jesus was a good guy. He did all these nice things. Didn't Jesus do good? Well, Jesus' purpose was also in this world to point out false prophets. The prophecy talks about how the Messiah would come, and not only would he build up, but he would tear down. And this is what Jesus is doing. He is tearing down an establishment that is not going to be so quick to go off into the night. Jesus is tearing down a stronghold. He's threatening the power of what a lot of people were worshiping as their true God themselves. They may have thought they were worshiping Yahweh. They may have thought they were worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But in essence, they were really just worshiping themselves. And Jesus comes in and begins to tear down the foundations of this false God. Their self-worship. Their self-exaltation. So, as we begin this, we have to look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 15. All the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him. And the Pharisees and scribes were complaining, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So at the beginning of the chapter, we see that there's an audience that's coming in. First of all, you have the Pharisees and the scribes. These were the religious leaders at the time. They're watching all of this. And what is coming in are the tax collectors and sinners. Now, when we think of tax collectors, we think of the IRS. My goodness, who loves the IRS anymore? Nobody really loves the IRS unless the IRS is the IRS. But you got to understand, tax collectors then meant something completely different even to us today. The tax collectors back then were usually of the Jewish people themselves. It was usually people that had sold out to the Roman Empire and were going around collecting taxes, and they were essentially mobsters about it. So, the Roman Empire would say, "Tax collector Ben, you need to go collect taxes from Miss Linda Casimir. Linda Casimir owes $100 in taxes." Okay? So I'm going to go, "Miss Linda, it's time for you to pay your taxes. You owe $500. $100 for, Caesar, and $400 for my trouble. If you don't do it, I'm going to turn you into the Romans." So not only was I strong-arming Miss Linda for the cash, but I'm also being a complete traitor to my own people. It was a very seditious position to be a tax collector. And here, tax collectors, the worst people, the traitors, the seditious people, were coming to hear Jesus speak. And the Pharisees are watching. The Pharisees are thinking, he better let these tax collectors have it. These tax collectors better leave here realizing what horrible human beings they are. And it also says he welcomes sinners. And when we see sinners like this, again, because of the vernacular that we've done in the church, sometimes it's lost its impact. But sinners here is really a catch-all word. Like in the sink, when you put that thing in the sink that captures all the gunk before it goes down the drain. That's kind of what this word is. That this was a word for the worst of the worst. We can't say what we really think. We're just going to put it all in a word called sinners. These were the people that were coming to see Jesus. These sinners could have been prostitutes. These sinners could have been Samaritans that somehow were stuck in this area. These sinners could have been just the worst of criminals. They were people that you really wouldn't want in your home. Tax collectors and sinners come. That sets the stage to when we get to verse 11. Actually, all of 15 is powerful and filled with parables. But we're going to pay attention just to this parable. In verse 11, Jesus also said, "A man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me.' So he distributed the assets to them." So Jesus, knowing that these tax collectors and sinners are before him, also knows that the Pharisees and scribes, the religious leaders, the guys who really set the rules for what counts as true, proper religion, are also listening. So he begins by telling them the story about a man who has 2 sons. My 2 sons. The younger of them says, "Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me." So he distributed the assets to them. I want you to think about this. So in this culture, so my brother and I were the only two sons of Dave and Lois Foxworth. And so my brother's the older brother. In this culture, that meant that my brother got 2/3 of the inheritance that my parents would have left. And then I, as the younger son, would have gotten 1/3. It was divided up more than that, but the older son always got the bigger share. And here we see that it's time, I want what's coming to me. Basically, I don't care if you're dead or not, this son says to his father. I don't care if you're dead or not. To me, you are dead because I want what I have coming to me from your estate right now, which is an insult, complete insult. And so he distributed to them what they had coming to them. And we know from history that meant that the older son probably received 2/3 and the younger son received 1/3. But it's interesting, and I want you to make an asterisk here. He distributed his assets to, notice it's a plural word, to them. He doesn't just go and pull out the money that the younger son wants. It says he distributed the assets to them. He divided it up amongst the sons, his estate. Now, why would the father do this? He knows what this younger son wants. He knows what's going to happen. I want to go out. I don't want to be a part of this family anymore. I want to go out and do my thing. Give me what I have coming to me. I'm going to go out and I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Why would the father allow this? Well, the one thing that we know about God, we see this throughout the Bible. We see this in Romans 1, and we see this going all the way back to the Garden of Eden in Genesis. Is God will let us discover the pain that we seem to desire. If you remember back in the garden, Adam and Eve, the serpent goes to and tells Eve and Adam, who was with her, all about what the fruit that's off the tree that God told them not to eat of would do. What does Eve do? She looks at it, she sees that it's good looking to eat, and it's going to be good for the belly, and even better than all that, she's going to get knowledge. This is what they wanted. So God the Father says, you're going to discover the pain. You want this. You're going to have it. God will let us discover the pain that we seem to desire at times. When we say to God, you know what, I want to go my own way, God's going to send us reminders. God's going to send us things to remind us who He is and His presence in our life. But ultimately, if we decide to walk down the bad road, He's going to let us. And the pain that we're going to experience is going to be what we really said we wanted. This is what happens with the father here in this parable. The father gives the sons their inheritance. Verse 13, not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had and traveled to a distant country, where he squandered his estate in foolish living. After he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he had nothing. Then he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food? And here I am dying of hunger. I'll get up, go to my father, and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven, and in your sight I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired workers.'" Gets this money, and he goes crazy. Have you ever read there is this the phenomenon of people that win the lottery? I'm talking about the big lottery jackpots. And does anybody know how fast they go through those big giant, sometimes 7-digit lottery prizes? Sometimes they're broke within a year. Now, if I won a $5 million jackpot, I can tell you something. At the end of the first year, there's going to be quite a bit of that left, because I wouldn't even know what to spend $5 million on. But here's the thing: is that when people get all that they want, they have a tendency to use all that they have. And that's what's happening here. He gets this fortune, he goes out, he lives it up, baby. And then it's gone. Probably the friends are gone too. The good times are over, and so what's there to do? The only thing this guy can do is find a job as a pig boy. Again, when you're talking about an audience here, and with this Jewish, with the Pharisees listening on, the disciples listening on, and the sinners and the tax collectors listening on, they know the significance of a pig. The pig is unclean. And here he's living with the pigs. He's living with the pigs, and he can't even eat as well as these unclean animals. He can't even eat it from the same pods that they're eating. I can't imagine, as Jesus is telling this parable, what the Pharisees are doing at this point. Yes. Get them! I hope you tax collectors and sinners are listening. That's what happens. Get them, Jesus. Maybe you're not so bad after all. Let's get some justice and wrath for this punk. That's why, when we hear about these things, we have to be so cautious of our own self-righteousness. If God decided to give us all what we deserve, it's not just the people that we don't like that are going to receive some rough stuff. There's dangers of being self-righteous. Now, as the sinners and the tax collectors here are listening, they're probably like, yeah, I get it. I know, it's where I'm at right now. I'm hearing Jesus tell this parable, and I know where this brother is, and that's where I'm at. I'm going to hang my head down in shame and just hear all of the shame that I have, more shame coming to me because I am a wretched, decrepit individual. And I know the cost, what is it going to take to return? How can this kid go back to dad? How can he go back to his father? I don't think there's a way. He's sitting there thinking about his father. What would that cost be? The younger son here is reckoned to be a slave. You know what? The slaves, my father's servants, eat better than what I'm eating right now. So he doesn't think, I'm going to hopefully go back and dad will just say, okay, here's your old room, son. I'm going to go back and I'm hoping that maybe he will let me be a servant and I'll sleep out in the bunkhouse. And I'll be a servant, I'll be a slave to my father. At least I'll have something to eat. At least I'll have a roof over my head. I don't even deserve that. The younger brother is reading, is thinking this, and he's thinking, I don't even deserve that. And the Pharisees must be looking pretty good here at this point. There's this hierarchy. There's this hierarchy of people that are really bad, people that are kind of bad, people that are good, people that keep the rules. And the Pharisees are like, we keep the rules. We're at the top of the hierarchy of what is right and what is good because we're good rule keepers. So they're hearing this, thinking this boy is going to come back. Maybe that dad would just say, you left, get out of here. That will be too good for him. Let's go on to verse 20. So he got up and he went to his father. But while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran, threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father told his servants, quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then bring the fattened calf and slaughter it, and let's celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, so they begin to celebrate. Now, there are some things, like I said, we can spend too much time trying to concentrate on stuff that isn't there, but we can see some stuff here that we can see is definitely reflective of God the Father. And the one thing here is that in verse 20, what we see is the Father was waiting for him. The Father was looking out. So when the Son is still a long way off, the Father sees him and is filled with Shtachna. What? I've talked about that here before. I think a few weeks ago, I talked about this. The word Shtachna, the Greek word for we get compassion. And that word, Shtachna, was a word that meant a bellyache. It was this passionate bellyache that you had for somebody. If you had compassion for somebody, it meant that your belly ached for them because of the situation that they were in. And this is the word that he sees. His Father has this compassion. His Father just stands out and says, okay, well, I'll wait till he comes and makes the first move. Son screwed up. He needs to come here. And if he answers the right questions in the right way, no, that's not what the Father does. What's the Father do? He runs to the Son. He runs to the Son. And when he sees the Son immediately starts saying, oh, I've done these terrible things, and what I want right now is, could you just let me be a slave? I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, but I want you to notice what the Father doesn't do here. He doesn't even acknowledge the Son's request of penance. He doesn't even acknowledge the Son. And the Son says, I don't deserve to be your son. Let me be a slave. He glosses right over it. Because all he has at this point is joy that his son is home. And he immediately says, let's celebrate. He doesn't stop going, tell me where you spent the money. Tell me all the things that you did wrong. And that's really, because that's what we do with each other a lot of times. That's really going to evaluate just how much grace I show you. No. The Father runs because his Son is home, he's alive, and he doesn't even care that his Son has lost all the money. He doesn't even care about what his Son has done. All it is about is that his Son has come home, and it is a reminder to us that God loves to save us. God loves to see us restored. God gets joy in seeing us come to him. It makes him happy to restore us. When I go through a time of sin, and I think to myself, I can't even look at God right now. I can't even, and I keep forgetting. You know what? God takes great joy in restoring us. God takes great joy in forgiving us our sin. And nothing was going to be able to pay this money back. The Son could have just decided, I'm going to be your slave for such and such a time until it's paid back. He wouldn't have even been able to live long enough to pay it back. Nothing could have paid that money back. The only thing that the Father was interested in, and the only thing that God is showing us, is a picture of grace. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Not because we deserve it, not because there's a shred of maybe they can get it right, but because we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Because of that, God so loved Dr. Ed that he gave his one and only Son. God so loved Judy that he gave his one and only Son. God so loved you that he gave his one and only Son. And it's not about what you've done, it's about what Jesus has done. That God had him do so that we can be made right with him. Usually that's kind of the climax of the story. And it's a great climax, right? It's a wonderful story. But Jesus wasn't just talking to the sinners and the tax collectors. who probably were hearing this in complete shock. There was another audience there. Verse 25, now his older son was in the field. As he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he summoned one of the servants, questioning what these things meant. Your brother is here, he told him, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older son's out in the field. You know what's interesting? I want you to notice who the older son did not talk to. He saw all the commotion. Now, who does the older son not talk to? He doesn't go, Dad, what's going on? No. He talks to one of the servants. He's there. Understand something. The older son is there. He's never left. But he's not connected with the Father. He's there, he lives there, but he's not connected with the Father. Verse 28, then he became angry and didn't want to go in. So his father came out and pleaded with him. But he replied to his father, look, I've been slaving many years from you. I have never disobeyed your orders, and yet you never gave me a goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your assets with prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him. Son, the father said to him, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. One thing that gets forgotten about is notice the father's actions. He does the same thing for the older son that he does for the younger son. When the younger son comes home, what does the father do? He runs out. And here we see in verse 28, his father came out to him to plead with him. He tells him this exciting news. Your brother, who we pretty much wrote off as dead, is back. What does the older brother do? This is the part where I just imagine that the sinners are sitting there, hearing this, heads down in shame, and then, what? And then I imagine over here you have the Pharisees, they're sitting there, what? This story is taking a very weird place. Because it's quite obvious now who the younger son is representing and who the older son is representing. And the older son starts with no joy whatsoever. Doesn't say, where's my brother been? Where has he been? Is he okay? Is he doing all right? Does he have all his fingers and toes? He doesn't ask any of that. It's nothing but complaints. I talked about how I preached this message as a little kid to my dogs. And it's also very instrumental. And there was a point in my life when I left the ministry that I said, I don't want to deal with the ministry anymore. I don't want to deal with people anymore. I'm just a little frustrated with the ministry. I decided to go out on my own, like the younger son. And I was, Callie and I were at a Bible study, and the Bible study teacher was teaching us. He went on this little rant about how the older son had every right to be angry. And I remember I couldn't just go up and throat punch him. I couldn't do that. That would be rude. But I wanted so much to say, you missed the point of this. If you think that the older brother had any right to be angry, that is not at all what the point of the story is. And it was very instrumental to reminding me that God had given me a responsibility, that God had entrusted me with a responsibility to preach His Word. And to preach it as effectively and faithfully as I could. And it began to turn me back into the place where I needed to return to what God had called me to, the ministry. This older brother is giving complaints. He has no joy, and he talks about how angry he is. And does he have a right to be angry? It doesn't matter, because that's not the point of this. The point of this is grace versus fairness. What's fair is that the younger brother get what's coming to him, but that's not. God is a very unfair God. Am I right? Because God is a God of grace. And God will give grace to those who need it and will receive it. And that's not fair, is it? But it's good, amen? The older brother's upset because this isn't fair, and the father is explaining, no, this is grace. Your brother was gone, he's come home again. Well, you know what, Dad? You're down there, you killed a fattened calf. We were saving that thing for something, and you just went ahead and killed it for him. And you know what? You never gave me a goat. You never even gave me a goat. And I want you to remember, as I said earlier, he had his father's riches. He was right there with his father. You know what? Filet mignon was always on the menu for the older son. He could have had it any time he wanted. But he didn't want to have that with his father. He was upset because the younger son gets the fat cat, because I don't even get a goat. Well, that's on you, older son. There's something else that he says here. He says, I've been slaving for you for many years. I've never disobeyed your orders. You've never even given me a goat so I could celebrate with my friends. I've been so good. I've not been naughty. But when this son of yours came, notice that disconnect. I will never forget my parents at times arguing with whose son I belonged to. My mom saying to my dad, your son, and my dad returning, no, your son. Here the brother's doing that. He's not saying my brother, he's saying this son of yours. I don't want anything to do with him. I have no connection with him. This son of yours. When he comes back, he's devoured your assets with prostitutes. You slaughtered. Wait a minute, what? Now, when we think of the prodigal son story, we think of the younger son. We think of him going out, and then him doing this wild living, and we can just, our brains kind of whatever that means. But I want you to, right now, I want you to go back and the beginning of this parable, in verse 11, and I want you to find me anything where he is running around with prostitutes. I'll wait. Let me just cut to the chase. It doesn't say that. Did he run around with prostitutes? We don't know. It's not the point of it. Again, we can go too crazy, but the point is the older brother here is saying things that were never said about his brother. Does he make him up? The point being is that he found that there's a sin that he shouldn't be forgiven of, that we don't even know if that was a sin. Which is exactly what this ruling class of religious elites were doing to these sinners and tax collectors. Just saying, well, you know what, you guys are guilty of all these sins, and you're probably guilty of these sins as well, just to make sure you stay down where we can see you and make you feel like you are garbage so we don't have to deal with you. I see so many times, and I tell you something, it doesn't matter who the president is. One of the things that drives me crazy is that when people start saying things about political leaders that, when especially the political leaders are really rotten to the core anyways, and then they have to add on things that we don't even know if that's true or not. It's like there is enough there, and there's enough there, we don't have to continue to add more stuff. What do you know? We're pretty sure that he has gills because he's half fish. We don't need to say those things. We don't need to do that when we have this attitude towards the lost. We don't need to have this attitude towards the people that are coming in. Well, you know what? If we let these people into our churches, they're just going to be a bunch of thieves. We're going to have to watch our wallets and our purses. We're going to have to make sure that because it's just going to be a bunch of entitled people coming in. All of these things. This is this self-righteous attitude where we begin to create sin that other people are doing. And this is what Jesus is trying to communicate. Not just the message of hope to the sinners and the tax collectors, but the message of self-righteousness that those guys, the bad guys, the Pharisees, were sitting there and they were espousing. And this is what Jesus is trying to communicate. And make no mistake, they knew exactly what Jesus was saying. The older son, in my estimation, is the true prodigal son in this story. Because if you're looking at the definition of prodigal as wasteful, what is more wasteful than the man who is with the Father, who has everything that the Father offers, but he wants to live in his own self-righteous cocoon? And he's wasteful with all that the Father can offer. That's why I don't think that the younger son is the prodigal son. The older son is just as lost as the younger son was, but the sad thing is that he's in plain sight. He never left home. He's home, and yet he's wandering even farther away than the younger son ever did physically. And it's a reminder to us that we need to leave our self-righteousness right at the feet of the King. And if we have called on the name of Christ for salvation, that we've been forgiven, and one of those sins that we've been forgiven of is self-righteousness. And yet so many times we as believers, we hold on to that self-righteousness, and that is just as much of a sin as the sins that we usually talk about. So they get mad, they get upset, they grumble, because, oh great, now Jesus is really starting to undermine us, and he's starting to get these people feeling like they can have hope. And if they have hope, then what power do we have anymore? You just think about killing them? Yeah. True repentance will expose other people's self-righteousness. I remember I was at a church one time where there were some people it was a family, they were a little challenging, and they had left the church. And a couple years later, they had come back to the church, and I remember there was a man that was like, well, I don't know if we should let them back, because I don't know if they're going to cause any more trouble or not. Now, is that a legitimate concern? Careful. Careful how you answer that. Well, there are things that we can do. There are things we can talk about. That, we can watch and we can see. But the fact of the matter is, if somebody has come back knowing, you know what, I've wandered far away from home. Now I'm coming home. That is rejoice. And if we want to hold our lists up and say, wait, you got to answer for this, you got to answer for this, you got to answer for this, and if you do that, then we'll open our arms to you. Then we have missed the point of the grace that God has showed us. And how we forgive others is how God will forgive us. When this younger son came home, he was repentant, and it exposed the self-righteousness of the older son, who didn't want his younger son to be repentant. He didn't want his younger son to come home. He wanted his younger brother to be completely gone so he could say, me and my father, we're like this. I've not left my father. When's the last time you've talked to your father? Well, I don't need to. I don't need to. I've got his best interests at heart. You need to listen to me. That self-righteousness is why so many times our churches are struggling. When we talk about how churches are failing, we can sit here and blame the world. We can blame the culture. We can blame this. We can blame that. We can blame MTV. We can blame the Three Stooges. We can blame whoever. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, our sin is ours and we need to own it, and the sin of self-righteousness is still alive in the hearts of the believers, and that sin has been paid for. Let us give that sin to God who's paid for it.